History is not a series of accidents, it is a ledger of consequences. And every empire that has ever presumed to place iron upon the necks of a people has eventually found its own foundations crumbling under the weight of that very metal. There is a mathematical precision to the rise and fall of civilizations, a rhythm that suggests no throne is eternal and no cage is permanent. When we look at the great titans of the past, Egypt, Rome, Spain, Britain, we see a recurring pattern where the height of their arrogance precedes a total structural collapse, usually within the span of 250 years. Today, the American experiment stands at 249 years, an age that historically signals the transition from late-stage decadence to inevitable dissolution. If we are to understand the moment we are currently living through, we must look beyond the noise of the news cycle and into the deep currents of prophecy and historical law. The collapse of a superpower rarely arrives with the theatricality of trumpets or the suddenness of thunder. Instead, it manifests as a quiet, systemic rot. It looks like the highest office in the land being occupied by figures who serve as mirrors rather than leaders, tweeting into the void at the break of dawn while the literal and moral infrastructure of the nation splinters. These figures are not glitches in the system, they are the alarm clocks of history. And as the ancient texts suggest, the divine does not hit the snooze button. To understand why this is happening now, we must revisit a text that has been frequently quoted but rarely dissected with the linguistic precision it deserves. In Deuteronomy 28, specifically verses 15 through 68, there is a blueprint of a specific condition that mirrors the experience of a specific people. When the traditional pulpit addresses these verses, they often skip the granular details found in the original Hebrew. The text does not merely say, "You shall be cursed in the city and the field." The word used is arar, which carries the weight of being bound, fettered, or hemmed in. It describes a state of being chained in the marketplace and fettered on the plantation. This is not a vague metaphysical cloud, it is a description of a tangible, legal, and physical confinement. Verse 32 and verse 41 get even more harrowing, speaking of children being given to another people, not sold or traded in a way that acknowledges parental rights, but given as if the biological bond never existed. The Hebrew word for captivity used here is shvi, which translates more accurately to spoil, plunder, or merchandise. It describes a human being not as a prisoner of war, but as an inventory item in a global ledger. This leads us to the geopolitical reality described in verse 43. "The stranger within you shall rise above you very high, and you shall come down very low." In this context, the stranger is the colonizer, the entity that arrived in 1619 not as a conqueror seeking a fair fight, but as a trader in human souls. This stranger did not just rise politically, they ascended spiritually, legally, and genetically. They rewrote names, suppressed languages, and re-imaged the divine to look like the oppressor. The depth of this low state is defined in verse 48 as serving enemies in hunger, thirst, nakedness, and the want of all things, while a yoke of iron is placed upon the neck until destruction is complete. It is vital to note that the Septuagint, the Greek translation used during the time of the Second Temple, uses the word zugos for yoke, the exact term used for the iron collars found in the holds of slave ships. Many modern seminaries attempt to relegate these texts to ancient history, treating them as a tribal narrative from 3 millennia ago. However, the text contains a specific end condition, until you are destroyed. In Hebrew, the word for destroyed is kala, which does not mean annihilated into non-existence, but rather completed, finished, or consummated. It suggests a divine process with a fixed expiration date. We find the specific timeline for this process in Genesis 15:13, where a decree is given that a specific seed would be strangers in a land not their own, enslaved and mistreated for exactly 400 years. History tells us that the first enslaved Africans arrived in Point Comfort, Virginia, in 1619. If we add 400 years to that date, we arrive at 2019.
The year 2019 was not just another year on the calendar. It was the year the United Nations issued a stinging report identifying the treatment of Black Americans as a contemporary manifestation of structural racism amounting to de facto apartheid. It was the year reparations hearings finally reached the halls of Congress, and it was the year the historical mask began to slip. To maintain the system of the previous 4 centuries, a theological lie had to be invented, the curse of Ham. This was a 15th century fabrication by European churchmen intended to justify the Portuguese slave trade. A cursory reading of Genesis 9 reveals that the curse was actually placed on Canaan, Ham's son, and concerned the specific land that would become Israel. It had nothing to do with the continent of Africa or the skin color of its people. This theological theft was the foundation of spiritual colonization. By giving the enslaved a white Jesus and teaching a theology of turning the other cheek while their children were treated as property, the empire didn't just chain the body, it attempted to chain the soul. They taught that suffering was a cross to bear and that justice was a reward reserved only for the afterlife. Yet the Jesus of the actual biblical text was a revolutionary who stood in a synagogue and declared his mission was to set the oppressed free, not metaphorically, but materially. The very book used to justify the chains actually contains the codes for liberation, provided it is read through the eyes of the elect rather than the eyes of the colonized. Consider the weight of history in a place like Charleston, South Carolina, in the mid-18th century. Imagine a woman, renamed Mary by an auctioneer, watching her 5-year-old son being sold for $40. As she felt the cold iron of the collar against her skin and watched her child disappear into the dust of a departing wagon, she did not pray to the blue-eyed deity on the master's wall. She appealed to a higher court, a God of justice who hears the cry of the oppressed. That prayer, and millions like it, did not evaporate, they accumulated. They moved through the blood of Crispus Attucks, the first to fall in the American Revolution. They fueled the 1811 uprising in New Orleans, and they guided Harriet Tubman as she transitioned from a nursemaid to a general. Today, that same energy is present in the struggle for clean water in Flint and the demand for justice in Ferguson. We see a recurring biblical pattern. Egypt oppressed Israel for 430 years before a series of plagues dismantled their economy, their gods, and their sense of security. Babylon held them for 70 years before an external power issued a decree of release. Rome, Spain, and Britain all saw their global dominance vanish after reaching the peak of their colonial exploitation. Britain, once the empire where the sun never set, eventually found itself unable to pay its bills, handing back colonies one by one as the 20th century progressed. America's timeline follows this scale. The wealth of this nation was not built on bootstraps, but on uncompensated labor. Cotton, tobacco, railroads, and the banking and insurance industries were all seeded with the blood of the enslaved. For 4 centuries, this system held firm, but the shift of 2019 signaled the beginning of the Daniel 2 phase. In the biblical book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a statue with feet of iron mixed with clay. The iron represents military might, while the clay represents a divided, unstable populace. This is the current state of the empire,
a powerful military-industrial complex resting on a foundation of social fragmentation. The stone cut without human hands that strikes the feet of the statue is the inevitable arrival of a higher justice. The political volatility of recent years was not a deviation from the American norm, it was a revelation of it. When hate crimes spiked and the quiet parts were spoken aloud by those in suits and uniforms, it was a signal that the empire had been forced to show its true face. This was the moment the prayers of the ancestors met the reality of the descendants. In 2020, as a global pandemic disproportionately affected those living under systemic neglect, the world watched a man die under a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That image broke the collective consciousness because it was a modern-day auction block, a visible manifestation of the iron collar. The response from the system, renaming streets while building private prisons or kneeling in kente cloth while protecting the wealth gap, shows that the empire cannot reform itself. It can only attempt to manage its decline. Currently, we are in a wilderness period. In Hebrew, the word for wilderness is midbar, which means the place of the word. It is in this space between the end of the old world and the birth of the new that identity is rediscovered. It is where you realize you were never a slave in the eyes of the divine. You were a king or queen in exile.
As we move past the 400-year mark, the iron is rusting. The question of what comes next is answered by the fact that judgment is not random, it is reproductive. It is giving birth to a new era. We see this in the 3 signs of the empire's final decade: economic inversion, demographic dread, and spiritual schizophrenia. Economic inversion is occurring as the very systems used to strip wealth from Black communities, such as predatory lending, begin to swallow the middle class whole. The racial wealth gap, which remains a staggering chasm, is becoming the catalyst for a global demand for reparations and systemic restructuring.
Demographic dread is the second sign. As the population shifts and the former majority faces a future as a minority, the panic manifests in the banning of books, the militarization of borders, and the desperate attempt to criminalize the teaching of history. They fear that if the Negro ever discovers the true value of their labor and the power of their numbers, the Republic cannot stand. This was explicitly stated in a confidential 1865 memo discovered in the National Archives, a document copied by a freedman named Charles, who worked in the War Department. He understood that literacy was more dangerous to the empire than weapons, because a mind that knows its history can no longer be governed by a lie.
The third sign, spiritual schizophrenia, is the collapse of the empire's moral authority. You cannot claim to be one nation under God while maintaining a judiciary that systematically guts voting rights and protects those who kill with impunity. This contradiction is driving a generation to leave the institutional white Jesus behind and find the God of the oppressed. This is the war behind the war. It is why there is such a fierce battle over critical race theory, not because it teaches hate, but because it teaches the very history that confirms prophecy. By the year 2030, the lie will have fully expired. We are already seeing the wealth of the nations beginning to move. In Isaiah 60, it is prophesied that the wealth of the seas will be brought to you. This is not a metaphor for a spiritual blessing, it is a description of a material transfer. We see it in African nations demanding the return of artifacts and reparations for colonial devastation. We see it in the diaspora returning to the continent, bringing tech, capital, and expertise back to the source. The gathering is not just about moving bodies, it is about the consolidation of power. The empire will not go quietly. History shows that Pharaoh did not yield until the cost became unbearable. However, the strategy for those living through this collapse is not to burn the system down, but to build an alternative within its ruins. The commission is to build while the empire sleeps, to buy land while they sell, and to teach the next generation the truth while the state attempts to indoctrinate them. Restoration, or shuv in Hebrew, means a return to an original state of identity and covenant. It is the realization that you are not a minority in the spirit realm, but a vessel of divine judgment.
The ledger is being balanced. The 1919 Army study that suggested containment was only possible if the people remained spiritually colonized has failed because the awakening has begun. The stones are being cut, the kingdom is arriving, and the iron is falling away. The God who heard the cry in Egypt and the cry in Charleston is the same God watching the timeline today. What an empire sows, it must also reap, and the harvest of 400 years is finally at the door. The only remaining question is whether you will be standing in the burning house or building the one that is designed to last.